Hello there. I used a different color. I borrowed it from Lovely Ladies in the other room because my marker wasn't very easy to see, so hopefully this is better. So step 5 is the how, right? Or W in the first letter of the second word, eaten whey, W for whey, right? So not whey protein powder. You know, I'm intolerant. You know that. Okay. So there's 3 typical approaches you're going to do for choice of law. You're going to do the first restatement, you're going to do the second restatement, or you're going to do the governmental interest analysis. Now, first restatement is typically always going to apply to what we call lex loci. I'm probably saying that wrong. It's probably like lex loci or something like that. So LL, whatever. So lex loci, I say it that way because depending on the field, if it's like torts or contracts or property, then you're going to, have a Latin name there for the actual place itself, because typically under the first restatement, where something happens physically, that's the law that governs, okay? Now when you have the second restatement, we have what we call the MSR. Most significant relationship. Some people call the second restatement the counting contacts restatement, because what you usually do, this is oversimplified, you'll see it is, but you usually just see how many contacts one state has with another regarding the 2 parties, and you compare. So if one state has more contacts with this pair of people, then they're probably going to apply that state's law. The whole idea is the person that has more of a physical connection or relationship with those 2 parties, they're the ones that are going to have the most interest in the result, and they're going to have the most impact, and they're going to want to resolve it more based on specific factors. So that's kind of where that comes from. So the last one is going to be governmental interest. They call this one the common sense test. It's so similar, but yet so different. And this one's kind of was created based on academics, and this is just really based on, I think, a journal article at one point. And pretty much the whole purpose of the governmental interest is, okay, based on what we're seeing here, which state has a greater material interest in the outcome, which is very similar to minimum contacts. So based on the weight of their interest, we are going to apply the state that has the biggest interest in this litigation. So the biggest way you could separate the two, because they're so similar, a minimum context is saying whoever has the most connection to these parties, we're going to apply your law. But just because you have the most connection with the parties does not necessarily mean you have the most interest in the litigation itself. Now you're like, okay, how could that be? Well, let's just say we have 2 individuals in California, and they go on vacation to Utah, and they get in a bar fight in Utah and severely injure multiple people there. Okay. If you sue, say you sue and the other person that's from the bar fight in California, both people are from California, you would assume under the minimum contacts test that the most contacts are obviously going to be California. They live there, they work there, domicile, residence, maybe they have a business there that's incorporated there. You have all these things, all these contacts. But where did the actual thing happen? It happened in Utah. Who is probably much more interested in the outcome of a tort issue in that case? Probably Utah. Why? Because it happened in their state. It affected their residents. It affected their state in a negative way. They probably have a greater interest in California, because what does California care what you're doing in a different state? They probably don't really care that much. So that's where the governmental interest test comes in. And the whole reason why it came about is because, so all these tests are trying to get the best result, the most just result, but none of them really do, which is why the courts have a tendency to wrestle with factors. There's really no clear-cut answer in some cases that we've looked at or that you look at, because the courts are really wrestling with the result that they want, but not every test gives them that result. So they'll make another result, or they'll make another test, or they'll make another factor. And so the problem really with conflicts of law is we're really just trying to figure out what's the best thing to do here. What's the best thing to do given this problem? And there's really sometimes no clear-cut answer. So that's where the governmental interest test comes in, is because Well, sometimes, it's not really sufficient. It's not really fair. It doesn't really make sense to apply a second restatement. Now, when do you apply either test? Well, typically, the state will say if they follow the first restatement or the second restatement. Now, here's where it can get confusing. Now, and I'm telling you this because you have to decide here which analytical framework you're going to start to follow. So, if you're in a state that follows the second restatement, but you don't like the result you got after the analysis, you might also then just do the governmental interest test. And you're like, why would I do that? Well, because the result just doesn't seem just, and you get to play court for a day, and you could say, well, even though this is the result from the second restatement, I'm going to also apply the governmental interest test because the result isn't really sitting right with me. You could try that. I know that there are some courts that have done a hybrid approach to where they mix the last two. And if you think about it, governmental interest is kind of a spin-off of the two of these, because typically where a tort happens in that state, typically that's the law that's going to govern. And in this case, with the governmental interest test, that's typically what they're trying to do, is they're saying, well, if a tort happened in our state, we want to apply our law because we're the most interested in stuff like that. So really, it's kind of difficult, because at the end of the day, there's probably other things they could have done, but that's kind of the mess here. That's the tension, if you will. So decide which one you're going to follow. Usually it'll tell you. If it doesn't tell you, you might have to go through all three, and that's fun. But typically it'll say the first restatement or the second restatement, or it might ask you who has the greater interest, and that would be the governmental interest. If you have a second restatement analysis, and it says a second restatement, you do it, and you notice that the analysis just doesn't seem quite right, it just doesn't seem quite just. To argue in the alternative, I would argue to also use the governmental interest test, and that way it gives you a secondary result. It also allows you to do both, because sometimes courts will use a hybrid approach if they think the result's not equitable. So once you determine what analysis to go through, then there are additional steps for that each analysis, right? Because you have to do A and weight. Isn't this so fun?